Good morning. I want to thank everyone for attending yet another session sponsored by your journal, Anesthesiology. This session, as I'm sure you all know, is Secrets of Successful Manuscript Preparation from the editors of Anesthesiology. At this session, we'll have the pleasure of a presentation by our editor-in-chief, Evan Kharasch, how to prepare a successful original research manuscript. Evan is professor of anesthesiology at Duke University. That will be followed by a presentation by our statistical editor, Tim Houle, a professor of anesthesiology at Harvard Medical School, Massachusetts General Hospital, on a primer of study design, analysis, and interpretation. And the session will conclude with a presentation by our executive editor, Deb Culley, a chairman at Penn, on how to write a review article and a few tips on what not to do. There should be plenty of time for discussion afterwards, so please note your questions as we go along, and our editors will be happy to answer any that you have. And with that, I'd like to introduce Evan. Evan, please.
Thanks, Mike. Welcome, stalwarts. Let me start with a disclosure slide of which I have none. I will share with you that originally another one of our executive editors, Dr. Andrew Davidson, was scheduled to give this presentation, but unfortunately, being from Australia, he wasn't able to travel. So I borrowed one or two of his slides for this presentation, and just to let you know. So when I think about preparing manuscripts, I kind of think of three components. There's the scientific aspect of the manuscript, the scientific rigor. There's the writing of the manuscript. This is prose. It's communication. And you need to have something which is a very clear communicative document, because the whole purpose is to transmit information and to do it transparently. And then the other aspect of writing an article is the scholarly integrity. And scholarly integrity is something which is being a little challenged these days. It's also something that we pay a lot of attention to at the journal. And I'll be very upfront that some of what I'm going to tell you is colored by my experience as an investigator. It's also colored a little bit by my experience having been an editor at the journal for many years and now the editor-in-chief. A well-written article it's not a guarantee that the science is credible or that people are going to understand or accept the message. On the other hand, if an article is poorly written, it really does increase the likelihood that it's not going to be perceived as credible. And so that's really one of the reasons that you want a well-written article. We also know that publication is no guarantee of truth. It's no guarantee of quality. It is a measure of persistence in many ways. If an article is not accepted at one journal, the likelihood is that it will be sent to another journal, and at some point that process will stop when the article is finally accepted. Sometimes when the article is ultimately accepted, it's a match between expectation and whatever journal you're putting it in. Sometimes it's changed from its original submission because authors have looked at critiques from prior submission and have revised their article accordingly. Sometimes if the article is rejected, it's just nanoseconds before it's turned around and sent unchanged to another journal. And we can sometimes timestamp that between something that was not accepted by anesthesiology and submitted to another journal, and often it's minutes between those two events. The things I want to cover is preparation of a manuscript, touch a little bit upon submission and peer review. Not a lot on peer review, but more often than not, a manuscript is not accepted unchanged on the first submission, so in that sense, preparation also involves revision. And then I guess the take-home message is what gets read. And the most commonly read parts of a manuscript are the title and the abstract. Very often somebody may read no farther than the title and the abstract. So when I think about elements, I think about a series of three-legged stools. And like most three-legged stools, you need all three legs for them to stand. As I said, the components of an article is the science, the writing, and the ethics. Then there's clarity, and there's the clarity of the purpose. You clearly communicate why the science was done, why the article was written. There's the clarity of the communication itself, the sentences, the structure, the flow, and the presentation, figures, tables, graphs, messaging, organization. The other thing is in writing a manuscript, it's really important to understand the targets. What's the target mission of that communication? Who's the audience? That's going to influence what journals you may send it to, how you craft your message, what your audience is familiar with, if you will. And then identifying the target journal. And writing a manuscript isn't just done in an abstract sense. If it's well written, you're thinking about what the journal is, what their style is, what their requirements are, who the audience is, and crafting the message for that particular journal. It's not a matter of simply putting a stamp on a manuscript and sending it off and then putting another stamp and sending it off somewhere else. If you're writing with the destination in mind, your success rate is likely to be higher. The other essential element of preparing a manuscript is to read the instructions to authors. Read the manual. And after you've read the instructions to authors, read them again and again. And I tell trainees, I'm an old guy, I like paper. Print out the instructions to authors and have them on the desktop, literally, while you're writing your article, so that you can refer to it again and again. So many times we will get submissions to anesthesiology where it's very clear that they haven't read the directions. Now, it's not going to get an article rejected, but sometimes it makes reviewers a little tetchy, if you will. So read the instructions. If you're not familiar with a journal, but you want to send something there because you think that's the target journal and the target audience, read a few articles in the journal. See how they're formulated, see how they're presented, fit in, if you will. And lastly, what I tell trainees is get your head in the zone. You know, it's like professional athletes spend a tremendous amount of time pre-envisioning before they play the game, if you will. Performers think about pre-envisioning the performance before they do the performing. Get your head in the zone. It's not a matter of sitting down and just writing. Most people can't do that. You kind of have to get your head in the game and write with the reader in mind. You're communicating, you're telling a story. Think about the reader. Don't just write in a vacuum, if you will. So when we read articles, we may read them from top to bottom. They're certainly organized from top to bottom. You know, the title, the authors, a summary, maybe a summary in the table of contents, an abstract, and then there's the introduction, the purpose, you know, the methods, the results, and the discussion. Writing a manuscript doesn't necessarily have to follow in that order. In fact, when I work with trainees, I suggest that they don't write a manuscript from beginning to end, but rather write it from easy to hard. And to me, the easiest parts are the things which are very factual. the authors, because hopefully that's been agreed upon. Do the data analysis first, obviously. Think about the audience, get your head in the game, and then it's tell the parts that are factual, like the results, like the methods, because the methods are just telling what you did. That's really easy and straightforward. If it's a clinical trial, you've already written the protocol. So start with the parts that you've done already. Then do the results, do the figures and tables, and then write the results section because that's factual as well. It's relatively straightforward. Hopefully, after the methods and the results, you're pretty warmed up and lubricated and comfortable with your story. And then think about either the introduction or the discussion, either one. And those kind of mirror each other in some ways, because the introduction is why we did it, and the discussion is what we found and what it means. Those are the parts that take a little bit more creative writing, if you will, and they may differ from journal to journal as you think about your target audience. And then the most important parts of the manuscript are the title and the abstract, because they're the ones that get read the most. And then there sometimes may be other bits and pieces. Some journals want you to write a 25-word summary. Some may want you to write a visual abstract, things like that. But those can often be saved for last. But you're going from factual to creative, and I think from easier to more difficult. You've got to keep in mind what kind of an article it is. Is it original research? Is it review? Is it observational? Dr. Houle is going to talk more about this. But again, you have to have a blueprint in your head. And that blueprint is going to look different depending upon whether you're building a single-family house or an apartment building, whatever. It's one size doesn't fit all. There are enumerated now a tremendous number of guidelines for preparing articles. There's an organization called Equator, Enhancing the Quality and Transparency of Health Research. And they have an excellent website. It's very helpful and very data rich. And they have reporting guidelines for a various number of study types. Last time I looked, which was last month, there were 476 reporting guidelines on the Equator website. You don't have to memorize them, they're all there. But it's a pretty good idea to check them and see what the standards in the industry are. Because if you deviate substantially from those standards, reviewers may suggest that you revise your manuscript to better meet those standards. So there's the art and the science of the title. It's the most commonly read piece of your article. Very often it's going to determine whether anybody reads beyond the title. It's going to determine whether it's read. Very importantly, it's going to determine whether it's found. Most people don't pick up a print copy of a journal and read it from front to back anymore. Most articles are now found by web searching. Web searching is done either based on the title or the names of authors, if you have a target author in mind, or the title. There's something called search engine optimization. And these are the things that search engines do to construct their algorithms. So you want your title to be what's called search engine optimized, which means the first 65 characters are what's often used in a search algorithm. So you want the most important parts of your title in those first 65 characters. So we'll often see things like the effect of, or a comparison of, or a clinical study of. If those are the first 3 words in your title, you've wasted 3 words because they do nothing for you in a search engine optimization. Put the meat right up front. The other stuff can go later in a title. Tell people whether this was a lab study, a clinical study. In clinical trials, there are now standard phrases that are often used in the titles for clinical trials. Try and use some of that standardized language, if you will. In general, questions don't make for good titles. They sometimes may make for a good title in an editorial, but not often in an original scientific investigation. And declaratives also don't necessarily make for good titles, particularly because if you're telling somebody the conclusion, why should they read further? Part of what you're trying to do is to get your readers to read your article. So you can tell the same thing several different ways. You can ask if black patent leather shoes really shine up. That's the question. You can make a declarative that black patent leather shoes reflect upwards. Patent leather and suede shoes, a randomized crossover clinical trial. Patent leather shoes, a systematic review and meta-analysis. These are all about black patent leather shoes, but the title's varying depending upon the nature of the article and how you're going to phrase it. The abstract is the other piece of the article that's most commonly read. And the abstract has to stand alone. It is the summary, it is the guts of what you've done. If it's well written, it should communicate the context, a little bit about the methods, a little bit about the purpose, the most important findings, and an abstract should always contain the primary outcome of a study, even if you didn't like the result. A very common thing that we find is that we'll look at a manuscript and the primary outcome isn't there because it didn't find a difference, so they just throw in the secondary outcomes. A well-written abstract will have the primary outcome, and it will have very clear conclusions, and conclusions which are supported by data, which is also in the abstract. Sometimes we'll see an abstract where all of a sudden you get to a conclusion and it's like, well, where did that come from? Because nothing that came before this informed the conclusion that you just gave me, the reader. And importantly, different journals have different styles of abstracts. And you've got to write the abstract with the journal in mind. Some journals like a narrative abstract. And you read the whole abstract and there's no data in there at all. There may be some observations and lots of p-values, because the p-value to some authors is the focus of the science. Other journals want a manuscript with data in the results. So different journals may have very different styles. Write the abstract for that particular journal. The introduction, you start to tell your story. What's the scientific premise? Why did we do this? What's the clinical problem? What's the scientific problem? A little bit about the prior knowledge, the context. The introduction's not a review article. You're setting the stage. Some information about the purpose of the study. What's the aim of the study? And a well-written article should, as you get to the end of the introduction, ideally, the hypothesis. Well-written articles will have a hypothesis. It's going to tell the reader exactly what you did, why you did it, how it was constructed. The hypothesis should be linked to the purpose and the aim. If you don't have a hypothesis, you've got to very clearly have described the aim, if you will. And also, beware of something that's called HARKing, which is an acronym that stands for the hypothesis after the results are known. And these sort of have a tell to it. If you read a hypothesis which is unbelievably specific and detailed and contains things which couldn't possibly have been known before a study was done, it's very clear that somebody went on some scientific adventure, came to a conclusion, and then wrote the hypothesis to match their conclusion. Those things sometimes declare themselves very quickly. The research question, again, what is the question? Why was this done? What did we want to learn? And is this something which is plausible? Is it measurable? Can it be done? Tell the reader, what do we know? What don't we know? Why we wanted to fill the gap. And again, it should end with the aim and the hypothesis. And there's different types of research questions. You can have qualitative research questions, you can have quantitative research questions. Tell the reader the nature of the study. For example, postoperative nausea and vomiting. Qualitative study is, what was the vomiting experience? We talked to a bunch of patients and said, tell us what that felt like, and tell us how you felt about it. Quantitatively would be, how often do people vomit after anesthesia? You could make it an observational study, an analytical study. What are the factors associated with the number of times that patients vomited after anesthesia? Or is it an interventional study? We tested the influence of drug A versus drug B as a prophylactic intervention against postoperative nausea and vomiting. And some people like to use an organization system called PICO, Population Intervention Comparator Outcome or Time Frame. That's a nice rubric on which to fall back on. Then the methods section. This is just the facts. What did we do? Parts of here that everybody wants to see and everybody wants to know is the ethical approval. If it was an animal study, did you get IUCUC approval? If it was a human study, did you get IRB approval? If you didn't get IRB approval, did you get IRB exception? Was there informed consent if informed consent was needed? Very often we'll see a paper that says this was approved by the IRB and it ends there, but the writer doesn't tell us whether informed consent was involved in the study or not. If it was a clinical trial that needed registration, was it registered? A secret is that anytime a reviewer gets a clinical study to review, the first thing they do is go to clinicaltrials.gov and call it up. And they start comparing the manuscript to the registration. So if you're writing an article, go back and look at the registration for your own study and make sure that what you're writing matches the registration. Tell us about the blinding and the randomization. Was it blinded? Was it not blinded? How was it blinded? Was it randomized? And if so, how? As we look at things, are the design and the methods appropriately and well described, and do they reflect what could or should have been done? A really good test of a well-written method section is if somebody else could come along and replicate your study. To me, that's the gold standard. Can it be replicated by somebody who didn't do the study? Talk about the population. Talk about the number of men and women involved in the study, the ages of the participants in the study. Describe the interventions very clearly. Tell the reader the primary outcome of the study and the secondary outcomes of the study. And we'll look to see that reviewers will look to see and make sure that these outcome measures are appropriate to the question that's being asked and the hypothesis that's being tested. Again, make sure that your method section meets those reporting standards from the equator. And if it was an observational study, tell the reader whether there was an a priori data analysis plan that was written. Very often, when observational work first started happening, people would go and get a whole bunch of data, and they would go through all the data and then decide what question they wanted to ask based on that data, and they would devise statistics to test the data to get to whatever question they wanted to ask. We focus on doing things the other way, and that is decide on the question, decide how you're going to analyze the data, and then do the data analysis. So we'll ask for those kinds of data analysis plans. And are the statistics correct? And Dr. Houle is going to talk a lot about that. Tell the reader about the primary and the secondary outcomes. This isn't a conversation about trials design, but it's a talk about writing the manuscript to tell what you did, so it's important to tell the readers exactly what the primary outcome was, how it was constructed. Hopefully the primary outcome reflects the hypothesis, and then list the secondary outcomes. Just be very transparent and clear about what was done. Be careful about describing things or using things that are sort of homemade. If you're using test articles, ideally they're validated, and tell the reader that it's a validated test article and where the validation report or validation methodologies appear. And sometimes you can have so many outcomes that you actually dilute your own message. Different kinds of outcomes. There's patient-centered outcomes, composite outcomes, surrogate outcomes. Again, I don't want to get into that in any great detail because this isn't sort of a talk about design, but it's really talk about messaging. And make sure that your message to the reader is clear and that they understand exactly what kind of outcomes you're looking at. Data analysis, I'm going to skip over this very, very quickly. Things like make sure that you've described the sample number and why and how you got to it and how it was calculated. Are you presenting the data appropriately? And again, talk about the results in a way that reflect the methodology. I'll reinforce the concept about observational research. Something from our instructions to authors in an editorial that we wrote is that manuscripts need to transparently state whether a data and statistical analysis plan was written a priori. And if it was it filed somewhere? Was it approved somewhere? Was it published somewhere? It doesn't matter that much, but again, we're interested in the transparency of the telling of your story. Again, what we call a data-driven analysis is not something that's generally well thought of, i.e. we looked at the data, we ground the data, we tortured it until it confessed, and a p-value dropped out magically. That generally doesn't fly well in this day and age. And so we give people in our instructions explicit guidance. Just tell us whether a plan was posted, where, if it was date stamped, time stamped, approved by your IRB, whether you simply stuck it on your hard drive and date and time stamped it. We just want to know. And post hoc analyses are perfectly okay. Not every study knows exactly what's going to be found. One of the fun things about what we do is that there is discovery. And sometimes you discover something that you didn't know you were going to discover. And it's perfectly okay to write that and publish it. Just tell the reader that we didn't anticipate this, but here's what we learned and here's what we discovered. And it's a totally transparent presentation. The results. When was the study done? When were the patients enrolled? Again, what was the results for the primary outcome? Then the results for the secondary outcomes. Are there any post hoc analyses that were done? When you present data, standard deviations, not standard errors. We'll learn more about this. Do the numbers add up? Look at your tables. And if you have tables, make sure that the numbers add. Very often we find lots of errors in data presentation. We studied 100 subjects, 49 were male and 46 were female. Very simple. Add the numbers, make sure they add. Do the results connect back to the methods? Do the results flow in the same way that the methods flow? Put them in the same order. Make it easier for the reader to follow. And you're going to present your data in figures or tables or text, but not 2 of the above or 3 of the above. So you've got to think about the strategy for how best to present your information. There's an art and a science to presenting figures, communicating a message. There's a book which I recommend. It's called The Visual Display of Quantitative Information. The author is Edward Tufte. He's got a whole series of books. This is probably the best known one, and it's how to visually present information. And I recommend it. Emphasize data. Minimize the amount of white space in figures. Sometimes we'll see figures and there's a giant figure and there's a little tiny bar in the figure and the rest of it is just white space. Fill the figures with information and minimize the amount of white space. If there's not much data, you don't need a bar graph or a figure. Make sure that the figures flow, that all the figures in an article are actually mentioned in the results section. Pie charts are pretty useless. And again, decide whether you're best to present information or figures or tables. Readers absorb information much more quickly in the form of figures than they do in the form of long, complex tables. And then the discussion section, which is basically, what does this mean? What's the take-home message? I think a well-written discussion section should restate the hypothesis, remind the reader, and then immediately tell the reader what the take-home message is. The major findings of this investigation were, and that statement should link back to the hypothesis. Discuss the primary outcome first, then the secondary outcomes. Even if the primary outcome didn't show whatever difference you were hypothesizing. Very, very often, if somebody didn't like what they found, they kind of ignore it. And that's a tell, if you will. Are the conclusions supported by the data? Very simple. And then start discussing the data, right? How does this new information fit with existing information? What mechanistic insights can the author share with the reader about the results that they got? What does this mean in comparison to previous studies? Does it agree? Does it disagree? If it agrees or disagrees, why might it agree or disagree? And then the limitations. It is perfectly okay to admit that a study has limitations. There's no perfect study. Sometimes authors may think that putting in a limitation section of a paper is an admission of failure. So then what they do is they put a paragraph before the limitation that says the strengths. It's pretty apparent to the reader what the strengths are. You don't have to generally tell them. But telling people about the limitations is generally a good thing to do. And then, are there unanswered questions or new questions that have been raised by this new data? Tell the reader. There's a statement which I don't like, and I'll admit that. It's my pet peeve. It's a statement that says, the conclusion of this article is that more research is needed. And a colleague of mine once said that their response to that is, well, then you should have done it. More research, to me, sounds like send me more money, okay? More research is not a conclusion. Unanswered questions is a viable conclusion, but I don't think that more research is needed is an informative conclusion. Things to beware of in a discussion. There's a lot of traps that we see people fall into. Is that it's too long, goes on for pages and pages and pages. We have restrictions at anesthesiology. You get 500 words for the intro, 1,500 for the discussion. You can have more or less in either section, but it should be about 2,000 words. Sometimes we used to see discussion sections of 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 words that went on for pages and pages and pages. It's not a literature review. Stick to the facts, stick to the interpretation. It shouldn't repeat the introduction because you've already said that. Sometimes a discussion will focus only on, quote, the positive findings and ignore everything else. Primary outcome, secondary outcome. There's no such thing as a negative study. If a study is well done, even if you didn't find, quote, a difference in some intervention, it's not a negative study. We got Dan Sessler to write an editorial for us about that last year. A well-done study that provides trusted evidence and value information is a positive study. Positive and negative shouldn't refer to the outcome, it should refer to the quality. So we don't like articles that talk about positive and negative results. Beware about sort of getting off target and starting to ramble. Conclusions which aren't supported by the data do not belong in a discussion. Things that you wanted to see but didn't see but want to talk about anyway don't belong in a discussion. There is a tell that we see which gives that away, and it's the word trend. If somebody didn't see what they wanted to see, they will often refer to a trend. That's not cool. Speculation, stick to the facts. And the other thing is spin. And spin is a really interesting thing. Spin is reporting or giving the reader an interpretation in a way that misleads them. It may be done in a way so that the results are viewed more favorably, or that you're trying to sway a reader's opinion, even if you don't have the facts. And there's really successful ways of spinning things, and successful in that they do create impressions in readers' minds, but it's really not good science. So I'll give you a few examples. Again, it's a kind of a distortion, swaying opinion. And there's strategy and tactics in the world of spin. So one strategy is reporting results in a way that distorts them, creates misleading conclusions, suggests a better result than was really obtained. Sometimes, if there's a discordance between the results and the interpretation sounds a whole lot different and a lot more favorable than what the data actually support. Very often you will find attributions of causality when the data don't support any evidence of causality. This is seen very often in observational studies. We observed X, we observed Y, and the whole discussion is about how X causes Y. No. And then there's sort of the over-interpretation or the inappropriate interpretation of results. And then there's sort of the tactics around spin. You may have a non-significant result, and it gets spun to say that the results are equivalent. Well, no, they weren't different, but they weren't equal. Use of causal language. We observed X, we observed Y, and clearly X causes Y. Lots of extrapolation. You may find clinical recommendations for patient care, but the results don't support that recommendation. That's just your opinion. Sometimes you may see selective reporting. They'll pick and choose among data, emphasizing the things that they want to the reader to see. And then there's, again, over enthusiastic interpretation. Trends is the big tell. Long explanations of why they didn't find what they wanted to find. Optimistic abstracts that just cherry pick or pick and choose. And then the failure to report adverse events. Here's all the good stuff that happened, but we're not going to tell you about the bad stuff that happened. So a couple examples of spin, and I'm not being critical of any one particular journal, but I will tell you that this also happens in quote unquote high profile journals. One example, effective perioperative gabapentin on post-op pain resolution and opioid cessation in a mixed surgical cohort, a randomized clinical trial. By the way, this is a good title. Tells the reader what happened, what they did. And so randomized double-blind active placebo-controlled trial on 400 patients, and they tested gabapentin compared to an active placebo. Methodologically, this is a spectacularly good study, because all the gabapentin studies that compared to placebo were biased because anybody that got gabapentin wasn't blinded because they were half asleep. They knew that they got the drug. So this used an active placebo of lorazepam so that everybody was half asleep. So they had primary outcomes, they had secondary outcomes, and they had pre-planned interim analyses. And it turned out that this study was stopped early because of futility. No matter how many more patients they were going to enroll, they knew that they were never going to see a different outcome. The primary outcome was the time to pain cessation. And gabapentin had no effect on the time to pain cessation. Primary outcome. Secondary outcomes, time to opioid cessation. And then it was things like pain at 6 months, pain at 12 months, how much opioid was being used at 6 months, how much opioid was being used at 12 months, and there were no significant differences among the primary outcome or the secondary outcome. Good, hard results, clear and unambiguous. And then you come to the conclusions. First conclusion was perioperative gabapentin had no effect on postoperative pain resolution, but had a modest effect on promoting opioid cessation after surgery. And based on these findings, periop gabapentin may promote opioid cessation and prevent the development of chronic opioid use. And the routine use of gabapentin may be warranted to promote opioid cessation and prevent chronic opioid use. Yeah, but wait a minute. The first sentence in the conclusion had no effect on postoperative pain resolution. Yep, there it is, right there in the primary outcome. And then you look at the other conclusions. And the data don't say that it had a modest effect on promoting opioid cessation because opioid cessation was not different. No, gabapentin didn't promote opioid cessation and it didn't prevent the development of chronic opioid use. And it didn't, you can't use these results to say that gabapentin may be warranted to promote opioid cessation and prevent chronic opioid use because it didn't do any of those things. So here's a total mismatch of the conclusions to the results. Spin. Another one, which recently in the journal that must be believed. Decompression with or without fusion for lumbar spondylolisthesis. We're all doing lots and lots of spinal surgery with lots and lots of expensive hardware. The question is, does it work? Really important question. So they looked at patients having surgery for lumbar stenosis with or without instrumented fusion. Important question, good question. The study design, 50-50 randomization, you got spine surgery with hardware or spine surgery without hardware. And it was a non-inferiority study and well organized, well conducted, well done. The primary outcome was disability after surgery, and the second one, there's several secondary outcomes, one of which was reoperation within 2 years. And the results were that the mean change from baseline in the disability score was -21 with decompression alone and -21 with decompression and fusion. Pretty unambiguous that instrumentation had no effect on the outcome. And the conclusion was that decompression alone was non-inferior to decompression with fusion over the course of 2 years. Hard, firm conclusion, well supported by the results. And then the second conclusion in the abstract, remember this is the part of the article that gets read most often, says reoperation occurred somewhat more often in the decompression alone group than the fusion group. I went, I don't remember seeing that in the results. So if you look back at the results in the abstract, there's nothing there about reoperation. Where did this conclusion come from? So you read deeper into the paper, right? Where's the data? So now you dig back into the body of the paper itself, and here's the results. They describe their secondary outcomes as not being adjusted for multiple comparisons and from which no definitive conclusions can be made. They state right up in the methods that you can't base any conclusions on the secondary outcomes. And there it is right in the abstract, a conclusion based on a secondary outcome. And then you look at the data. And it says reoperation was performed in 12% of the patients with decompression and 9% in fusion. No difference. So where did this conclusion come from? Spin. Beautiful example of spin. And then lastly, the references. Everybody does the references as an afterthought. But wait a minute. Your manuscript is a communication document. You want to help the reader learn. So where they can find more information is really important. What is the basis, the rationale, the justification, the evidence for the statements that are in the article? There's actually scientometrics and bibliometrics that have found that an average about a quarter of all the citation and published articles are wrong because people are careless. Different kinds of carelessness. You actually go and look at the references and the facts aren't in the reference that is cited. Sometimes it even says the opposite of what is claimed or stated in an article. It may be an inappropriate population. You did a study in kids, and this is a reference to a study in adults, without disclosing that, for example. Sometimes there's what we call secondary citation. You may cite an article, and all that article did was cite another article where the actual information is contained. Well, don't make the reader chase. Give them the source of the primary information. And as I said, sometimes you go back and look at that citation and it didn't say anything that looks anything like what was claimed in the citation. The other thing that's interesting is that 70% of referenced facts are found in the abstract, not in the full article, which tells you that people are doing nothing more than looking at Medline, reading the title and maybe the abstract of an article, taking the information out of that abstract and citing it in their new article without ever having read the article in the first place. And again, common inaccuracies, the facts aren't there, they're not found, it's an inappropriate population, and the numbers and the information doesn't add up. So, do's and don'ts of citation. Do citation of articles after you've read that article to make sure that it says what you're claiming it says. Cite the primary source, not a review article which cites a review article, which cites a review article, which cites the primary source, which says something completely different. Don't just provide the evidence, but put it into some context. I will often read articles which are constructed like the following. So-and-so reported this. So-and-so reported that. These other people reported the other. But there's no context or interpretation for the reader of your article. Help the reader understand what you are trying to communicate. But put enough information in there that a reader can understand and judge for themselves. And then when you're constructing a manuscript, use a reference manager. Hand typing references into your new manuscript is not time efficient, and it invariably results in errors. So use a reference manager. Don't cite articles simply based on the title or the abstract. Don't do secondary or tertiary or quaternary citations. Don't extrapolate things from other articles just to match what you really want to say. Animal studies don't support human studies, if you will. And don't assume that the citations in somebody else's article are accurate. Go and look at that source that they cite. A couple of words about integrity. Things like authorship. Authors. Is everybody who's an author on a paper, do they qualify as an author? Does everybody who qualifies as an author listed as an author? Is the authorship appropriate? Have you disclosed the funding sources for an article? Have you disclosed possible conflicts of commitment? And a conflict of commitment is not necessarily a conflict of interest. And conflict of interests aren't necessarily bad as long as they are managed appropriately. And are there any undeclared conflicts of interest? Because we know who's doing science, and we may know people have undeclared conflicts, and if they're not declared, it reflects badly on the article. So why does authorship matter? Authorship confers credit, and it confers responsibility and accountability. Everybody's focused on the credit, but they tend to forget about the accountability and the responsibility. These things are inseparable. Many different organizations have different requirements for authorship. Many journals may have different qualifications for authorship. The minimum one that's common to all of scholarly work is a substantial contribution to the work and accountability for the work that was done. Very simple. Authors on a manuscript need to know the criteria for authorship within their particular discipline. And different disciplines do have different criteria for authorship. The world of biomedical research has different criteria for authorship than the world of astrophysics and particle physics, for example. We may read articles in particle physics with 2,000 authors. You'll never see 2,000 authors on a biomedical publication because the culture is different. So you want to be sure that you are in line with your discipline's culture. Criteria for authorship should be in line with institutional criteria if your institution has criteria. Only about 24% of institutions actually have criteria for authorship. And then most importantly is the criteria for authorship to the journal to which you are submitting. And if you are going to repurpose an article that wasn't accepted elsewhere, make sure that the criteria for authorship mean that all the people who were an author on the previous version qualify for authorship for this new journal. Commonly used criteria for authorship are those of the International Committee for Medical Journal Editors, ICMJE. Those are published on the ICMJE website. There are 4 criteria: substantial contribution to the conception, design, work, or acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of the data, drafting or revising the article for important intellectual content, final approval of the version that will be published, and agreement to be accountable for all aspects of the work and ensuring that questions related to the accuracy or integrity are appropriately investigated or resolved. The editors of the journal Anesthesiology have a slightly different set of authorship criteria. And I'll point out the major differences. There's 3. First of all, we have 5 criteria instead of 4, because we broke out and separated criteria number 4 of the ICMJE. The second thing that we do is we actually title each of our criteria to make them very clear and helpful: scholarship, authorship, approval, ethics, and integrity. And the last is a very subtle difference, which has to do with the word execution in the scholarship domain, not acquisition, because those 2 things can be very different. Acquisition means that you had a fellow who ran and got a blood sample on an ICU patient in the middle of the night, but you can't pay them extra for doing that, so you make them an author. That's not authorship. You did a study in the OR, and you put a bunch of surgeons' names on the paper because that's the price of letting you study their patients. They're not their patients. They're our patients. And they were an endocrinologist patient the day before and a cardiologist patient the day after, but you're not putting the endocrinologist and cardiologist on the paper either. Authorship is intellectual. It is not transactional. And that's why we say execution, not acquisition. But different journals will differ. Be careful about unacceptable types of authorship: gift, guest, and ghost authorship. And we call these out at anesthesiology. Gift authorship is like an honorific or a courtesy. It's offered from a sense of obligation or trust or dependence, where you give somebody authorship but they don't deserve it. And a common example is you put a department's chair's name on a paper. Not cool. Not acceptable. There's guest authorship, because you think that putting so-and-so's name on a paper is going to increase the likelihood that it's accepted or increase the likelihood that it's well thought of. famous professor so-and-so. That's guest authorship, and that's not considered acceptable either. And then the last is ghost authorship, where somebody who should be an author is not an author. And this is often what you see with industry-sponsored trials where a paper is written by a for-profit company and they shop it around for somebody to publish. Or it was an industry-sponsored trial and the people who did the trial are named as authors, but the person who actually wrote the entire manuscript is not listed. It's not the role of journals to decide who should be an author. ICMJE has a really nice explicit phase that it says determining authorship is the responsibility of the authors, and it's not the role of journal editors to adjudicate this or to referee fights. We don't mix in. Why does this matter? This is a very favorite phrase of mine. Authorship abuse is not a victimless crime. It's because the entire scholarly publication process depends on trust. And if scientists or clinicians are willing to lie about who was involved in the study, why should we think that they're going to be any more honest about the findings? So at anesthesiology, we pay attention to this. So to put a little bit of a bow on this with one more message, when you're finishing up the manuscript, read the instructions to authors again and make sure that it fits. Is the manuscript in a specific journal format? Are the figures formatted correctly for that journal? Is it organized in the right order? Sometimes they may want you to put the methods last. Sometimes they may want you to put the methods after the introduction. Write a cover letter which tells the journal why you're submitting and what the major message is. Is there any supplemental digital content, other figures and tables that aren't going to be in the manuscript but are going to go along with? Make sure they're part of the package as well. One final check, does everybody who's an author qualify, and are all the authors included? Did you make all your disclosures? And make the whole thing easy for the editorial office and the reviewers. The less work you make reviewers do, the happier they're going to be. And a good place to look, there's a website called Editage, which has lots of tips and tricks for submitting manuscripts. And just in the last couple of minutes, because most people don't get their manuscript accepted on the first submission, there's a revision process, which is part of manuscript preparation. I will give you the secret sauce as to what we do as reviewers at a journal. 5 points. It's really simple. There it is. Does this address an important research question? Is it novel? Is it the 18th study or 157th study of the same drug for postoperative nausea and vomiting? Is there a hypothesis here? Does it make sense? Is it cogent? Do the experiments test the hypothesis? Do the methods match the hypothesis? Is the study well executed? Does the manuscript match the registration? Are the results valid? Are they well presented? And are the conclusions supported by the results? My co-editors may have other features. They may beg to differ, but to me, this is the secret sauce. You know, if the answer to this is yes, more than likely the manuscript's going to get accepted, probably with revision. It's either going to get rejected, or it's going to be asked for revision, or it's going to get accepted. And the whole goal of the exercise is to get to accept. And you know, peer review, it should not be cruel and inhuman. It should not be torture. The purpose is not to weed out. The purpose is to weed in and improve. We're here to improve manuscripts. Whether the manuscript improvement is a result of the peer review process is either in the domain of the science or it's in the domain of the presentation. We look to help authors improve manuscripts. The only people that see the initial submission and know what the final product looked like are the editors. And there are some manuscripts that look vastly different when they're ultimately published. compared to what they look like when they first come in through the benefits and the improvements of the peer review process. Our bias, that's why we're there. When you get a revision back, the best thing to do is read the letter, the decision letter, and then stick it in a desk drawer. Because your first reaction is going to be emotional. And more than likely, it's not going to be positive, okay? Because you never get a letter with one word on it that says, accepted. Doesn't happen, okay? You're going to get a letter that tells you that your baby's ugly. Or you're going to interpret it as a letter that tells you that your baby is ugly. Just stick it in the desk drawer. Get beyond the emotion. Don't let it sit in the desk drawer for more than a day or two. Don't forget it and don't walk away from it. Go back and read it again. And invariably, when you reread it, you'll find out that it's not as bad as you first thought it was when you first read the letter. And then just sit down and read it, and then just figure out how you're going to plan to respond to it. Revise the manuscript, create a reply document. And the reply document is real simple. It's a point-by-point recitation of each reviewer's comment, your response to the comment, and whether you changed the manuscript. Very simple. The clearer you make that document, the easier you make it for the reviewers the next time around. Don't put phrases in there like, make it simple, like, we agree, here's how we changed the manuscript. We respectfully disagree, and here's why. Manuscript reviews are not a command performance. You don't necessarily have to agree with every comment and comply with every comment, but you have to respond to every comment and do it intellectually, not emotionally. And every once in a while we'll see every comment is the response starts out with, we humbly thank the very expert reviewers for their knowledgeable and insightful comments, which will improve our manuscript and make it better and more valuable, and we're very grateful for the opportunity to respond and provide this answer and improve our manuscript. And then you get to the next comment, and the response to the next comment is the same sentence, and on and on and on. You don't have to do that. You're not buying points with the reviewers. The best way to guarantee that your manuscript's going to get rejected is to get angry and fight with the reviewers. It's like they taught you with your oral boards. Don't fight the examiner, okay? Don't fight the reviewer. It's an intellectual dialogue. It's not an intellectual sword fight. So here are the secrets to writing a bad manuscript. Bad design, bad methods, selective reporting. We told you all the data we gathered, but we're only going to show you the stuff that we want to show you. Inappropriately interpreted data and a poorly written manuscript. If you do all these things, you're going to get rejected. And then we did an interesting thing. We polled our editors and said, what frustrates you? So this is an interesting accumulation of input from our editors about the things that they find when they read manuscripts with which they find fault or error or problem or just makes them upset. And I'll let you stare at it for 30 seconds. All this whole talk will be available on the journal website. But again, these are the common errors that people make in writing manuscripts, and these are the kinds of things that you can avoid. And then lastly, Anesthesiology is building an author resource center. It's accessible on the journal website. Talks like this are being recorded and posted up on our journal website. And the whole idea is to provide resource for our authors to make their job easier and better inform them. So with that, I will finally stop, I promise. And Mike, do you want us to do a panel at the end, or do you want to take individual questions?
Let's do a panel at the end.
Panel at the end. So there you have it. Thank you.
Wow, that was very thorough. I must admit I learned a lot by listening to that. I think that was fantastic. My job is to talk a little bit about the methods and statistical part of a manuscript preparation. And the title of my talk was supposed to be something about a primer, which is hard to do in a setting like this, particularly because it's difficult to know where everyone is in terms of their methods and statistical knowledge. So I decided to frame my remarks in a way about how you might prepare your manuscript, keeping the methods and the statistical analysis, and along the way we'll sneak in some primer stuff as well. I'm also going to focus more on trying to give you a process for how you might think about the methods and statistical analyses of your manuscript, where you might go to get more information, and how to best improve that for your chances of success. So I do have a few disclosures. I'm the statistical editor of Anesthesiology, another journal. I've got some NIH grants, but I don't think any of this should come into play for what I'm talking about today, other than my obvious bias for anesthesiology. I think you should submit your best work there. Okay, so here's my general outline today. I'm going to talk about general tips for submission to anesthesiology in particular, and then I'm going to talk specifically about a methods section, a stats section, and a results section. They're, of course, very linked, but I'll break them up into pieces so we can just focus more on the ideas for each one. So let's start off with submissions to anesthesiology. I don't know if you heard, but you should read the instructions for authors. I think this is a really easy tip to offer, but boy, it's something that a lot of authors don't do. It's particularly if you're submitting to a journal that you're unfamiliar with, it's good to go and get those instructions for authors. In anesthesiology, we're using what's called the IMRAD, Introduction, Methods, Results, and Discussion. And as Evan said, the abstract we view to be the most important part of the manuscript. He had a great statistic for us. 70% of the findings cited only look at the abstract. One of the best ways to make your research more impactful is to make your article citable by looking at the abstract alone. So that would be looking at the methods, the results, etc. Having a structured abstract is very important for us because you can actually disseminate a lot of your findings by using the appropriate subject headings like method section and then the results. We actually require a statistical analysis section for every manuscript that has empirical data. A lot of journals don't do that. They just have the statistics blend into the methods. We'd like a specific stats section for your data, for your manuscript. So pay attention to that. I thought I'd also just give you a look behind the curtain in terms of how we review manuscripts. So we ask the editor, the handling editor, and the reviewers to rate your manuscript on these criteria. And these are, I think they're pretty self-explanatory, which each one of them are. But from my point of view today, these two are probably very much related to the methods and statistics. How definitive is the science that you're presenting? Is it hypothesis generating, or is it pretty definitive? Can we actually infer something about what you found? And of course, the scientific impact has everything to do with the methods, the statistics, and the results reporting. All these criteria load onto a general overarching construct. We call it quality, but I think these two are particularly important. So keep that in mind when you're writing your methods and statistics. We want studies to be definitive. The more definitive, the better. Does this answer the question as much as it can be answered? What's the uncertainty that lingers after doing your study? Okay, so that's my general tips for anesthesiology. Let's talk about the methods preparation. Here's my summary of the methods preparation. I'm going to go into each one of these in far more detail. And again, I'm thinking about a process here more than just babbling at you about a lot of details that we could do. Okay, carefully attend to the ethical issues. I think it's fascinating that medical publishing, at the front of the methods section, we have an ethics statement with some kind of informed consent or assent, depending on what your subjects are. And I think the reason why I find it fascinating is because what we do for these articles is the barely minimum acceptable standard. And that's exactly what we do in every article. What is the minimum ethical requirements to actually get into publication? But the ethics of research is its own field of study. If you want to prove this to yourself, seek out a research philosophical ethicist. Talk to them about your work and what would be the ethical underpinnings around what you're trying to do. And I think you discover that there is an entire area here to think about. terms of what's the burden on the participants or the animals. How could you minimize that? What's the way to communicate the risks to the human subjects, et cetera? I think doing this is really, really important. To get into anesthesiology, other journals, that third one there, that third bullet point, ethical board approval and written informed consent's all you really need, but there really is a lot more to think about here. Okay, the next one is avoiding salami publishing. So when you actually do a modern research study, an important conversation to have with all the authors is, how will we disseminate this work? Most research methods now are pretty complicated. It involves different specialties, and coming together, how will you disseminate this work? Will it be one manuscript? Will there be 3 manuscripts needed to disseminate all of the findings? How are we going to do that as a group of authors? And most importantly, how are we going to avoid publishing just the least publishable unit? So we'll just take the data and cut it up into 3 pieces, each one of them being less impactful than if we just did one big study. Unfortunately, it is very common to watch authors take what would be a pretty definitive study and break it up into very small, unimpactful pieces and send those out into the world. It's also unfortunately common to have those pieces overlap with each other. So if you read an article or 2 articles by the same author group on the same research effort, you can see the same tables appear in both of the articles. So this is actually overlapping data, and that's a no-no. We shouldn't duplicate the findings. Each finding should be published once and only once. If you're gonna have overlapping or salami publishing, that's a no-no. I will say at least once a month, I'll discover an article that I'm reviewing actually has been published in part somewhere else. And in that case, there's no quicker way to get to rejection than to say, well, you've already published this. This isn't going to be impactful for our journal, and you actually have already disseminated these findings. So be careful about that. I think the world would be a better place if authors were limited to how many articles they could publish every year, and they had to do their best to get all the important information from a study into one finding. Okay, duplicate publication is a little bit different, like self-plagiarism, and I think our understanding about this is evolving. So when you write your paper, how much of the words in the paper can you self-plagiarize? Can you write, if you write the methods section, let's say you're an animal experimentalist, and you do the same methods pretty much every time. Maybe you're varying the investigational agent, but for the most part, you're doing the same thing over and over again. Well, how much of the manuscript can be just repeated from past publications? I think it's okay to reuse method statements. It is okay. That if you found a great way to write that, then you can write it again. You can use that same language. Probably shouldn't duplicate results or things like that. So I think you can duplicate to a certain extent, but keep in mind most journals use a piece of software called Authenticate, which actually looks at the degree of overlap in the language. So when the editors look at your work, they'll say that 70% of your method section overlaps with a previous publication of yours. That's not strong, but if you can certainly have pieces of it overlap. So when you write your methods up, just be aware of that. Okay, let me get to the first piece of important information I'm going to try to offer to you about a process. When you're writing up your research, can you name the design? What I'm looking for here is a piece of jargon that actually describes what you've done. And I'm going to be hard on authors here. It's too common, let's say, to read an article and not know what the research design was. Let me give you an example. This is a matched cohort study. This is a systematic review and meta-analysis. This is a repeated measures crossover design, elements like that. If you could name the design and have that design title appear in the title or abstract, maybe both, and then of course again in the methods section, it's going to be so much easier on your readers because there are elements of the design that naturally lead to how you're going to represent the article. So more of that in a moment. But again, if you could name the design, then you can actually start to say what hypotheses or aims can be related to this design. Now hopefully you've done this already. But for example, I think it's pretty common to see a mismatch between the type of design that you're using and the hypotheses that you're trying to address. If that's true, that's going to be a bad article because you can't accomplish certain things with certain research designs. Some more examples for this. So We can put the research design into very broad categories like clinical trials, observational. So are you randomizing individuals? Are you not? Are you just observing them based on physician choice? What type of subjects are used? And then what type of experiments are done? And then of course, are you analyzing previously conducted studies, or are you actually creating new novel studies? And then within each of those, as Evan pointed out, there's 430 some different reporting guidelines. There's exquisite differentiations among each of these study designs. The better you can do to put your study into a particular category, the easier it is going to be communicated. Okay, here's something that's pretty frustrating. There are a lot of different systems for categorizing research. So depending on how you were trained or where you come from, you could have a different system for naming your design. Psychologists, social scientists have one group of definitions. Epidemiologists have famously invented their own. From anesthesiology's point of view, it doesn't matter which system you use, just use one. If you want some more tips on that, I can talk more about that later. Okay. Another important tip is this equator network, and it is one-stop shopping. So if you remember one thing from today, from my talks, it's that the next time you're starting to think about doing some research, go to the equator network, name the design, and find the appropriate checklist or guideline to help plan your research. The equator network offers checklists for reporting, but I like to use them for design too. So if I want to see, at the end of the day, when I get my manuscript ready to be submitted, what will I want to have stated in the manuscript? Well, if I know that ahead of time, well, I can actually plan to make sure that we have all those things covered. Okay, more in-depth tip. Each of the guidelines, there's 2 major publications for each guideline. So like, for example, Consort, which is for clinical trials. There's the publication related to the checklist. So they tell you what the items are, and how you would satisfy those items. They give you examples for words you could use to satisfy that. But more importantly, there's a document called the Elaboration and Extension. This is the publication where they explain to you the thinking behind the items. When the group of investigators were coming together to plan the consort, they explained to you why they came up with the items they did and what's underneath them. I think the elaboration documents are the single best written manuscripts in all of medical science. I reread the Strobe, the Consort, the Arrive, the Start, and the Prisma every year. They're very, very well written, and they can explain a lot about the design items. I'm not the only one. I think the Consort's been cited 110,000 times. Same with the Strobe. They're very well written, and they can really help your work. So reread those if you're up on trying to plan your study. Okay, so those were my tips for the methods section. Was name the design, find an appropriate checklist, read the experts' views on how to do those designs, and then write your manuscript there. I wish I could tell you elements that needed to be in your methods section, but I don't know what work you're doing. And so in those checklists are going to be an exquisite amount of information that need to go into your methods section. If you're doing an animal study, it's a very different set of methods, of course, than if you're doing a systematic review. Okay, so let's talk about the statistical analysis section. This is my favorite section of a manuscript. Of course it is. I'm an applied statistician. These are the points I'm going to try to encourage you to look to go for. Sufficient details. This is what I'm going to try to have you avoid the stats section. I'm going to give you an example of that. We're going to tend to the level of measurement, and we're going to think about statistical power. There's a lot more to it, but this is what I'm going to talk about today. Okay. The uniform requirements for medical journals encourages that all published scientific manuscripts have a certain minimal level of information, and there it is right here. It's for the stats section, we want to know the software. Believe it or not, if you're running a chi-squared test, you can actually get 2 different answers depending on the software you use. I know, that's pretty frustrating. But that's why we have to know what software you're using so we know what type of algorithms you're running. The criterion for statistical significance, if you're using null hypothesis testing, we need to know what that is. Hypothesis testing, are using 2-tailed versus 1-tailed. A bunch of famous examples of people sneaking in 1-tailed hypothesis testing, where you're only looking in one direction. One group is greater than the other. The default is 2-tailed hypothesis testing, where you're looking in either direction. One group could be greater or less than the other, so you spend your alpha on either side of the distribution. We need to know the assumptions underlying the tests. We need to know the actual tests applied. And you're going to see this in a moment. Please don't just list the tests. We did chi-square, t-test, ANOVA, and regression. That's not enough. We'd like to be able to replicate your analyses if given access to your data. So the only way to do that is to go through each of your tests independently and how you apply them to your data. And then how will you report the data, the mean, the median, et cetera. And then correction for multiplicity. Are you correcting for multiple comparisons? All right, let me say something that's not on this list. I wish it was on here. This goes a bit beyond, but this is the advanced stuff. It's recently been argued that all statistical analyses fall into one of three categories. Either you're doing a descriptive analysis, where you've got a bunch of data that you think represent the population and you're describing it. Is your work a descriptive analysis? If so, it'd be great to state that. Inference. Are you inferring a relationship between two variables, an exposure and an outcome, a treatment and an outcome? Inference would be another goal. Most studies are inference-based. Are you inferring a relationship in the population from a sample that you've drawn? The third one is prediction. Are you trying to predict some outcome or some event in the future? Prediction studies look a lot different than inference studies. So description, inference, or prediction. If you were able to communicate that in the stats section, it's going to go a long way for helping your reader understand what you're doing. One of the biggest mistakes I see is analysts who clearly don't delineate those groups. So they do a clinical trial, and in their clinical trial, they throw in a prediction model. Well, a clinical trial is designed to do inference. It's not designed to do a prediction model. So if you want to put that in as maybe a hypothesis generating, but usually it's superfluous and it's not needed. So description, inference, and prediction. If you can distinguish between those three goals, I think your paper will be greatly strengthened. Okay, recently on Stats Twitter, that's right, that's a thing. Statistics Twitter is a strong thing. A group of statisticians wrote the stats section. Here it is. This is the modal stats section that you read. Give it a look. It applies to just about every article out there. It is not specific. It doesn't tell me much other than what I might need to get the reviewers off my back. I've got software. I've got a two-sided hypothesis test. I've got a p-value. I've got tests listed there. I've got some assumptions. The Kolmogorov-Smirnov test. I've got descriptive statistics. I'm going to tell you this statistical method section is bad. Nothing tells us that you didn't think about this more than giving us this stats section. It'd be far better to explain what your assumptions were, what you're trying to do, and how you did it. So avoid the stats section. Okay, my third point is types of measurements. I think the greatest gift you can give yourself when you're working your manuscript is, what are your measurements? How are you measuring the things in the study? Whether that's the exposure variables, like for example, are you have an ICD code to determine a certain type of procedure? If you're doing animal studies, how are you measuring the exposure? Is it some kind of outcome that you're looking at? How do we do that? Are these measurements well validated or reliable? In my opinion, one of the greatest weaknesses in medical science is the lack of attention to the measurement properties of our variables. Most of the time, the things we're measuring are very poorly measured. That's because what we're doing is hard. But in that case, the relationship between variables, if you're doing an inference task, can only be so strong. Two variables can only be related to the extent that they're measured reliably. Okay. Now here's a neat way to think about levels of measurement. This system was created by social scientists in the 1920s, but boy, I like it. Nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. As you go down the list, the amount of information in the variable gets higher. The more information in a variable, the easier it is to find relationships among them, the less subjects you need in a power calculation. If you can measure something using a type of measurement that's lower on this list, you should do so. It's better on your outcomes. I won't go into those any much more, but there they are. Okay, my fourth one for statistical calculation is power calculations, or generally speaking, sample size. It's unfortunately common to write a manuscript where the readers are left to wonder, why do you think you can answer your question with the sample you have? Is this sufficient? Are we going to be able to identify and figure out what's going on in the population that you sampled from? So putting a power calculation, if you've done it beforehand, is really great. If you're doing a sample size calculation, you don't have to do it based on the p-value. You can do it on the precision of the estimates. For example, you can say, we're going to calculate an odds ratio, and we want to have a certain width of the interval estimate, the confidence interval around the odds ratio. We want to have an odds ratio, we're going to assume it's 1.5. We want it to be plus or minus 0.25 on either side. That will be a definitive inference. That's how we're going to plan our study. So something like that would be really great. Post hoc power calculations are terrible, and they should be avoided. Post hoc power calculations are just based on the p-value. You don't need to do those. But you should do some kind of sample size estimation. Okay, my final section is on the results preparation. I've got 3 big tips for you here. The results section, as Evan was saying, is critically important to communicate what you found. And there are a lot of real common ways to do it. And I must admit, the way you probably learn to write results section is probably not the way to do it. We focused a lot when I was in my training about reporting p-values and statistical inferences based on null hypothesis testing. What we've come to realize in the last 10 years that statistical analyses is really the management of uncertainty. What is the uncertainty in our findings? What are the sources of that uncertainty? How do we communicate that uncertainty to the reader? And we've learned, and I think we did know this before, but I think it's been reified the last several years, p-values are a terrible way to communicate uncertainty. They're a garnish for your plate. Okay, let's talk about that in more depth. So the first one is missing data or lost data. As Evan stated, sample sizes are one of the most important things you can communicate to the reader. How many individuals or units did you enroll? And how many did you actually analyze? Differences between those two represent a threat or a source of bias for your analysis. We're going to want to know what's the extent of missing data or lost data. There's a lot of different reasons data might be missing or lost. And so here's a challenge to you. The next time you read a paper, see if you can identify missing data. Most of the time you can't. It's something authors don't tend to report. But if you lead with that in the methods and the results section, it's going to put your paper in the right format. Because if there's missing data, you might want to do something about it. If we know that the data are missing, we can start to understand what the threats might be. So we could characterize who had missing data. Like, for example, I read an animal study where the investigators reported a bunch of findings on animals that survived the experiments. They enrolled 24 animals, 8 of them survived, and those are the ones we got to read about. But if you think about it, those were the rare ones. And so we don't get to know what happened to those other animals. If they took measurements along the way, they just excluded those animals from the analysis. It's even more common in observational studies to have profound amounts of missing data. I read a study the other day where there was 70% missing data from one of the variables. So, 30% of the subjects were analyzed because they had complete data on all the variables. Well, those 30%, they may not be like the 70% of people who had missing data. We need to know that. We need to be able to understand what's going on. There are methods for this: multiple imputation, maximum likelihood estimation. There's a lot of great write-ups for that. I won't go into that anymore. Okay, so the reporting of the results. Here's some questions to ask yourself. Can you identify the size of the effects and the uncertainty in them? Are more than just p-values reported? And a great way to do this is using descriptive statistics. What is the uncertainty in the findings? P-values encourage dichotomous thinking. When you design a good statistical inference, it can lead to a nice dichotomy. Like, for example, in a clinical trial, if you've balanced the benefit versus the harms, if you've carefully thought about the effect sizes that you're going to study, and you're using a Neiman-Pearson hypothesis test, you thinking about it dichotomously is probably okay, because you've planned it that way. But the vast majority of p-values don't do that. We conduct a p-value based on the available sample size. We're looking at the p-values as if they tell us something, even though we didn't plan the inference that way. In which case, we don't want to view the p-values as being dichotomous, yes or no. We can report them, but what we really want is variability estimates on the effect sizes. So mean, standard deviation for each group, and then what's the effect, and then the uncertainty in that effect. And confidence intervals are really great. So for example, like odds ratio 3.5, 95% confidence interval 3 to 4. That tells us a great deal about the uncertainty. When you report your results in the abstract, this is what we're going to want in anesthesiology. If you read any of the big journals, that's what they do as well. I would say if you can do something different, see if you can write your next results section by not using the word significant. See if you can not use significant, only report the findings using point estimates of the effect with confidence intervals, use exact p-values, but see if you can avoid writing significant. You're actually writing significant when you report a p-value, if you know it or not. But focus your presentation on the magnitude and the uncertainty of the effects, and it'll go a long way for helping your readers understand. Here's 2 common errors. Contrasting p-values. You see this in animal studies all the time. The treatment group was significantly different than baseline, but the control group was not. That is a very common sentence in animal studies, and that is not valid. If you want to compare the 2 groups, you should compare them. Like Evan said, failed superiority does not equal equivalence. The groups are similar in the primary outcome, p equals 0.745. That doesn't tell me that the 2 groups are similar. That tells me that they were not different based on a null hypothesis test, which may or may not have been properly conducted. So we can't do that. Okay. And then interpretation. Evan mentioned this a lot. Does the interpretation reflect the actual data? Are the primary outcomes treated as primary? Selective reporting is the scourge of science. I ran 100 hypothesis tests. I'm going to give you 7 of them. Unfortunately, the other 93 will never make it to the light of day. I don't think that's a good reporting practice. If you analyze the data, we want to see it. It could be put in supplemental content, but it needs to be reported. And then I mentioned before, can the study design support the interpretations? There's a couple of famous examples there. Convenience sampling is a problem if you want to get prevalence estimates. You shouldn't interpret observational studies as randomized designs. And then the pre-test, post-test is a common design, but there are a lot of limitations to interpreting them. All right. Evan talked a lot about spin, so I'm going to skip this in order to give our next speaker some time. You should, let me just go with this really fast. So focus on statistically significant results. Within group comparisons, most of the time we want to look at between groups. If you're trying to determine the difference between A and B, you want to look at the difference between them, not within group comparisons. Subgroups, modified analyses, all these are important topics, but they're oftentimes not done well. We can talk more about this if you'd like later on. Okay. I'm going to go to my final take-homes. Here they are. If you can identify your study design, you should. Find a way to state it in a very succinct way. State it and focus on reporting it in the title or abstract in the methods section. Give enough details to allow someone to replicate your study. Replication is the backbone of science. We can't replicate your work unless you give us enough information about how to do that. Using the methods section is really key, but also remember you've got supplemental content where you can put more details if you'd like. Report your findings using a wealth of descriptive statistics and uncertainty estimates. P-values are a garnish. They're not the main event. And hopefully doing this will help keep your study and give the best chance of getting into journals. Thanks so much.
Well, I have to tell you, I'm a little bit surprised. I expected to see 1 or 2 individuals in the audience, and there's more individuals in the audience than there are lecturers today. So thank you for sticking with us all the way to the very end and being here to share with us some of our perspectives with regards to things to do and not to do when you're trying to either write a manuscript, do your statistical analysis, or write a review article. And I'm going to emphasize the review article component, but you're going to see some common themes. So one of the things I'd like to remind you is that there are 3 people on a podium and they say the same thing each time. You might want to listen to it. These are my disclosures. I have funding that's not related. I'm a former director of the ABA, not related, and an executive editor of Anesthesiology, which is, and I happen to be one of 2 individuals who handles a lot of review articles. And we see a lot of really, really interesting review articles, but there are a couple of things, if you're thinking about writing a review article, that you should really be asking yourself, because they're really important. And we see a lot of non-experts trying to write review articles, but the problem there is that they usually can't synthesize the information and put it into a perspective that's really relevant to the readers. The first one is, where should I send this review? So, you really don't want to send something to anesthesiology that's on astrophysics. It's probably not going to make it through. Mask off. Thank you, Dr. Kharasch. Does it fit within the journal's aims and scope? In other words, you really want to identify what is it that we're looking for. Is it content that's going to be relevant to the readers of the journal? You've heard that previously. The readers of the journal are truly your audience, and you want to make sure that you're writing your manuscript in a manner that they can understand and that they can read. Are you an expert on the topic? I mentioned that first off, but over and over again we see review articles that have probably been labored over for months that have very little chance of making the light of day simply because the individuals are not experts in the field. Is there a prior review on the topic? So we see a lot of review shopping where somebody will write a review on a really cool topic and their buddy will write another review on the very same topic and send it to a different journal. And we don't need 15 journals on review articles on the exact same thing. We'd really like to have things that are up to date and are different from the things that might have come out a previous month. And do I have pre-submission approval? What does that mean? Well, in anesthesiology, we actually require that for review articles or clinically focused reviews, that you actually submit a proposal so that we can make sure that the authors are true experts in the area, but in addition, that it is a review topic that hasn't been recently looked at. So I'm going to run you through something really, really quickly because I have a lot of people that tell me they don't really know what they need to do. So they write their review article and then they go to the website. But there's a really important angle that you want to think about, and that's that if you know you're going to write an article for a specific journal, go to the website first. So, any of you who've got your little smartphones or cameras or iPads, www.asa.org. That will get any ASA member into the journal, but it takes a couple of steps. You want to go in and you want to click on this little button that says Research and Guidelines, and then you want to click on the journal. So that's quite a few steps. And then you get really excited because I finally found where I can submit that review article that I have spent months working on. And you see this little button that says Submit Your Work. Don't go there yet, okay? That is not where you want to go because that's when you're ready to submit it. We really want you to get prepared for submitting that manuscript. You don't want to go here either because it's got a lot of lovely things that tells you about the journal, the editorial board, but it's not going to tell you about where to submit your manuscript or the things you need to do. You really want to go here. This is the Do All, Be All place. It's the For Authors section. And you want to go and look at submission advice. What's submission advice? It's the kind of things that we've created in the Author Resource Center to help you decide what you need to do in order to publish your manuscript. And it's a pretty long process, but there's some really great things here. In other words, you want to really know what it is that you're doing before you actually do it. And in there, you're going to see this lovely, lovely spot that talks about the things that we look for in anesthesiology. And the most important component is in red. Anesthesiology prioritizes the publications of foundational, enduring research that informs the scientific foundations and clinical practice of the perioperative pain and critical care medicine. If it isn't related to something like that, your review article probably isn't going to fit in the journal very well. There are also a couple of recordings on on the website by Dr. Kharasch and Andrew Davidson that really help you to understand the types of things that you need to have in an article. And so I'd encourage you to look at those. But you're not done yet. You then can kind of go to this Author Resource Center again. And there, you're going to find the same submit button, but don't go there yet because your review article, it is just not ready for prime time. If you scroll down a little bit further, there's this thing called Instructions for Authors. Now, have any of you heard about the Instruction for Authors? Yeah, okay, so we're here. This is the single most important thing that you can do prior to beginning to even write your review article. And it's really, really important. You can go to the website, you just keep clicking, you can download a PDF, and Dr. Kharasch had suggested that you might want to have a paper version, and I would think you're going to need 12 or 13 because you're going to need one before, during many times, and after you've written your review article to make sure that you've actually lived up to those expectations. The other thing you want to do is kind of perform a literature search, and you need to tell us how you did that literature search and what type of a review article you're going to write. But as previously mentioned, you want to make sure that whatever you're writing fits within the journal's aim and the journal's scope. That was in the instruction to authors. Little reminder. There are a lot of reviews, and there are so many things that you can talk about, but the best reviews are talking about a hot topic. Something where there's an increase in the amount of information in the literature, where things have changed, where there's a debate, and that's part of the reason why we really want experienced authors to write these review articles, because they're the individuals who oftentimes know both sides of an argument. They contain critical discussions about the controversies in the field. This is the best part. I know I've got a winning review article when the reviewers and the authors are arguing back and forth. We respectfully disagree is a very common sign of a good review because they're giving their perspective and the reviewers might have a slightly different perspective because they come at the same information in a different way. So critical thinking and the ability to synthesize the information, I cannot overemphasize enough. This is not a sport for somebody who's new. This synthesis needs to be, though, at the level where the average reader of the journal can comprehend it and understand it. That person who's sitting in Port Orchard, Washington, administering an anesthetic, needs to be able to understand what it is that you're talking about. If you're writing it for all your brilliant friends who are experts in the field, you've wasted your time because this really is an education component. You're writing this information for those people who literally know very little about your subject content. And so you really need to make sure that you're writing it for them. You're not writing it for yourself. You're not writing it for your peers. You're really writing this manuscript for the readers of the journal. The other thing that's really interesting is that these best manuscripts really do challenge previous ideas. They look at things from a different perspective. They give a description of the current literature, but they oftentimes will develop these new ideas or novel ways of thinking. So you're not just looking at something the same way and saying, gosh, you know, malignant hyperthermia is malignant hyperthermia, and we know how to treat that with dantrolene. The introduction of the concept of the ryanodine receptor was a pretty big, very important change. So those review articles on the topics very quickly changed as well. I've written a number of review articles over the course of my career, and it is a very challenging exercise. And after you've been doing this for a couple of months, your brain starts to think, this is really good. This is my masterpiece. But always find your most critical friend to scrutinize your review article. My friend that I choose all the time happens to be a long-term mentor. He's a little older than I am, and he has this red pen. And I don't think I have ever sent anything in to any journal that has not turned into red and made me want to cry. But in the end, if you can accept that harsh, critical judgment from an expert, you're going to be okay. But it's painful. But you're not done yet, because there are a few things you absolutely don't want to do. And these are really important. I've kind of mentioned them, but I want to make sure and reiterate them. If you have to convince us that you're an expert and you do not have experience in the field, you're not. And I know it's really, really nice to invite your less experienced colleagues to try to draft a review article, but those will only be successful if the senior author basically rewrites that manuscript. And we see this happening all the time. And so please, this is really something where we want experts in the field, those individuals who've at least a number of publications in the content area. And it's really not a place for individuals to learn about the particular content area. Now, I mentioned my friend. Well, he studied delirium, and I will never forget my first review article. This one is my masterpiece, months. Mind you, I had been out of residency for 1 year. And he read through it, and he didn't put any red marks on it. And I was like, yeah, everything else I've done, he's red marked like crazy. Instead, he just says, were you delirious when you wrote this? No, I was not delirious, but I was extremely inexperienced. And from that, eventually it got published, but it wasn't because of what I had written. It is what my mentor had created out of this dismay of individual thought processes from all these wonderful articles that I had collected over the course of writing this review article, but I had failed to synthesize the information. There were controversies. There were things that just didn't fit together, but why didn't I synthesize the information? I didn't have the experience or knowledge to be able to do so. This is what I call regurgitating data, and I was an expert in that particular manuscript at regurgitating data. And, Dr. Levy and I have talked about this a lot. We see this a lot, and it is most certainly going to lead to rejection. So please synthesize the data in a review article. We talked about this over and over and over again. The data is not enough. What does it mean? What does it mean to the expert? What's the expert really trying to tell you? That's what we're trying to get. And I am going to say it over and over again. Evan's going to say it over and over again. You really need to synthesize the information so that the reader can understand what it is that you're doing. With that, I'm going to go ahead and stop because we have a little bit of time left, not a whole heck of a lot. But if you have any questions for any of us, or you're interested in submitting a manuscript, please let us know. And if you're going to submit a review article, make sure and get pre-approval. Thank you.
So I want to thank the speakers for really incredible presentations. I got a lot out of them. I hope you did as well. And we want to open this for questions. If you have any questions about anything they presented or anything they may not have touched upon that's pertinent to you as authors of research manuscripts or review articles, please step to the microphone and have at them. Please.
So John Mansold, director from Wyoming, practicing pain physician in my 30th year, never published anything, a reserve Army career, sort of stepped on that. But now at a point where I can see patterns in a pain clinic. I see people, about 5,500 patients a year. And so I have an observational study I'd like to publish, but I want to make sure that before I set my A priority, who's going to be in the study and how do I select them? To whom in rural Wyoming can I send a query for advice on how to construct the observational study, both for the group of people I think are suffering a side effect and a cohort of people that are not exposed to the same drug and have what I consider to be that side effect. Can I just email it to you at your MGH address and just go, okay, here's what I'm looking for, here's my hypothesis. You know, it's because I don't think you get paid to help me out in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming, but I'd like to be able to, before I start writing or collecting the data, make sure that I've got a good observational study design in the pocket before I start down that road.
All I was going to say is the world really is your oasis. You can get a hold of almost anyone via email, talk to them online. I mean, many of our meetings are now done virtually. And so I would encourage you to look through the literature in the area that you're talking about and find someone who's truly an expert in that area, in that field.
I've not found anything. It's completely
Well, you mentioned
untouched.
pain medicine, so that's a good place to start.
Well, I'm just seeing patterns with anti-inflammatory drug use chronically that I can see, I can identify it in a history and physical exam, and now I've started doing labs on these people, and I can see a definable pattern, but I can't find that anyone's ever touched it.
So do you have an IRB?
I have to use the Western because I'm out in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
I appreciate the challenge, and I guess a couple of messages. One is scholarly investigation is not the exclusive domain of the ivory tower. And I think that community practice underestimates the value of the information that they have, and that there's value in sharing it. So I really like your idea. I also understand the challenge. Your expertise is in clinical care, it's not in this exercise. And you need to phone a friend, in a sense, and you know, thoughts about where to find that. Just ideas off the top of one's head. You know, look at the list of associate editors of anesthesiology. Look at the list of associate editors in regional anesthesia and pain medicine. What are the journals that you read as your source of information? Look at the list of associate editors in those journals, and it may take firing off a few emails, but basically asking for help. There are various ASA committees that may be relevant to your area. I think there's one on regional anesthesia and acute pain. There's probably one on chronic pain. There may be some people on those committees who have publishing experience or scientific experience. And I think you've sort of taken the first step and said, hi, I need help, right? And I congratulate you, because there's a lot of people who don't get to that step. And so I think that finding a colleague or collaborator who can help you in this is a reasonable first step.
Great. Yeah, I'm going to jump on that one as well. So yeah, congrats on thinking this way. Let's name the design. I think it sounds to me like you're working on a cohort study where you're not randomly assigning treatments to individuals. And so people are getting treatments based on either your perception of their benefit or something else. So a cohort study is notoriously hard to do. Unfortunately, the default for cohort studies is bad because of bias and confounding. So I would say the best advice I could offer is, you, just like you led with, you need a research methodologist, probably a statistician who's an expert at such things. If you email me, I will help you find one.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I think all these recommendations are excellent, and please be assured that we have all been contacted by people like you who have an interesting question and need help in approaching it, and we welcome these queries from investigators, and we're more than happy to help them. And I'm sure we'll find someone who can help you.
It's even bigger than that. Most of us are begging to get community practitioners to help us do our studies, because those of us that do live in Ivy Towers have abnormal patient population. We don't take care of the patients that you do.
Thank you. Other questions, please? Comments? Any concluding thoughts, Evan?
No, I just want to thank Deb and Tim and you for doing this. And I guess the take-home message is that we want good submissions, we want high-quality submissions, and now I'm speaking from a journal perspective. And our goal, in very large part, is to help authors improve manuscripts and get them to the point of publication.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'd like to echo that, because it is that author's stewardship that comes across as a little bit abrupt during the review process, but it does make your manuscripts better and publishable, and that's why anesthesiology is as wonderful as it is. So we really are trying to steward you through the process.
Thank you very much. And thank you for coming.